we are here with BC architects, two members of the team, Laurens Bekemans and Ken. They are both based in Brussels. BC is not just an architecture office. It's BC consists of BC materials, BC studies, and BC architecture. Brussels cooperation that is focusing on, and we will elaborate on that, on different architectural practices that varies from developing to constructing. And everything that in between, even material production. And then there is Assemble. We have here James and Joe from Assemble. Assemble is a British-based architecture collective. It is, for me, one of the most promising relational architectural offices that are there, that are incorporating the social in their practice and developing all kind of collaborative practices that go beyond sustainable thinking alone and involving people in their practices. So that's a bit the two collectives that are sitting in front of us, and we joined them at Luma. We had the chance at Luma to bring them together because they have very complementary practices and are currently developing Atelier Luma, or the new Atelier Luma, on the site of Luma in the Parc des Ateliers in Arles. The question is to kick off. That's the question we started with several people we had conversations with. Is what kind of world are you living in now? Very simple but complex question, I think.
I think if I'm just gonna head out, I think there's one word I think of immediately. That's transition. I think it's a society in transition, or at least it's the one society we kind of feel related to, and that links also to kind of uncertainty. It's a society, or at least a moment, where there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of trial and error, at least where we, or the focus we have, and the people we work with. It's a lot of experimenting and finding new ways of doing things, being architecture, being construction, and everything which is linked to the built environment, let's say. And therefore, I think transition is, for me, a good word or a good way to start, because there's no answer, and there will never be an answer, I think. So it's a lot of taking risks now, or at least feeling and touching many facets of architecture which were not touched maybe before, or in different ways by architects themselves, and seeing how our practice can be relevant in a world, or at least in parts of the transition.
I see also a world of a lot of chains being broken up, like supply chains and links and everything, and other kinds of chains being set up, like a lot of kind of resilience of human nature or something. Some for the good, some for the worse. It's not all good. I think there's a lot of people who are setting up new kind of chains and like profiting also, but like on both sides, just like chains breaking up and new chains being set up in a super fast way. That's kind of making me wonder or something about the world.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty that Laurens talks about is probably feels like the kind of clearest description. I mean, there's somebody in our office who always, whenever you ask him, Louis, kind of how something's going. His response is always, it's too early to tell. And even after 5 or 10 years of something, he just likes this idea that it's always, you can never really reflect kind of fully on the success or failure or opportunity of a particular situation. And I think it's really interesting, like even in a conversation we were having in the office the other day about whether actually now that, like in the UK, the Labour Party has a more credible leader, so something like the governing party might implement something equivalent to the New Deal when this starts to loosen. But then on the other hand, so on the one hand, there's this immense optimism that there might be the total opposite of the austerity we saw 10 years ago. And then on the flip side, you have all the kind of strongmen leaders who are probably going to be much more protectionist and much less kind of internationalist. And so it's just, it feels like suddenly these two visions, which are like so fundamentally opposite, seem totally possible to anyone that really advocates for them. And for what that means for us, I think, in a way, like thinking back to the last time there was that much uncertainty, it made lots of little opportunities that were very distinct from traditional architects. That's kind of how we got started, which was trying to find, a bit like Lawrence is saying, really, like any way in which the skills we had could be relevant to the situation. And sometimes that was organising people, sometimes it was organising kind of projects, sometimes they were just kind of cultural events and ways of bringing people together that had a very light kind of building or architectural component. And I think that's something that I really enjoyed about our practice and enabled us to do an awful lot of things quite quickly in a way that you can't always do when you're looking at buildings. But I think it seems really certain that certainly less buildings are going to be built. I think it might really push the change in the building industry much quicker, because even the climate movements, being architect-led, were still very resistant to tackle the underlying problem of building being a hugely damaging and inefficient act, like when it's done new. That was still something that was really being resisted, I think, by lots of the larger people leading the kind of climate movements within the construction and architecture industry. And so I think it's hugely uncertain, but there's so many opportunities to think about, and maybe a more like nimble and resourceful way of applying design skills to lots of problems that are maybe more local, because we'll all be traveling obviously a lot less, and those concerns become immediately more urgent and relevant than maybe some of the further afield ones we've been thinking about in the last few years. But it feels very uncertain and very open, I think, doesn't it?
I think it's true that what you say, like by saying uncertain, it opens up all perspectives. And because I think both of our practices, or at least our generation, when we finished our studies, we entered actually a world which was in crisis, or had crisis different of the one that we are experiencing now. But so it meant for us as starting or coming in society and starting practicing architecture, it meant immediately for us to look at different or other ways to enter this world, and the kind of conventional ones which were taught to us at university or at school, at architecture schools. And due to that uncertainty, I think it opened up so many more perspectives and made us realize that actually being an architect or having a practice doesn't mean building. Doesn't mean that at all. And I think that is very interesting. And it's also, I think, sometimes also scary. You don't have a kind of system you work with. Everything is a blank page at the beginning. So it opens up a lot of possibilities. But because of that, also a lot of obstacles, I think, which are still there. I don't know how it is with Assemble, but I think as BC we had sometimes to fight, really, to kind of not to fight or to discuss a lot and to push different ways of looking at construction in general.
I think a lot of the stuff that we started doing we did through naivety in a way. So not knowing so much about something. I think when you know too much, it kind of might stop you doing something because you don't realise all the different things that you would have to go through in order to make that thing happen. And so certainly with the first projects that we were doing, it was kind of a bit more, through being naive and through like wanting to do it for the first time or something, I think you kind of get further.
Yeah, in a way, like as we've kind of built up experience, it's become more possible and less necessary for us to advocate for the way that we think work or practice should happen. Originally we didn't have the option of winning and competing for projects on conventional terms with other architects. So we couldn't build, and we had to find other ways of employing our skills or trying to improve, situations which were fundamentally different. But that never got much easier, actually. It was always a kind of exception rather than an expectation that we would be able to pursue a relatively unconventional or more open or more collaborative approach in a project. And at this point, there's more of our projects than ever which are being pursued in a relatively conventional way, because from the point of view of the person spending the money, or even from our point of view, it's very risky to do anything else. And I think what might be interesting when everything gets mixed up in the way that it is at the moment is how it becomes not so much a greater risk, but just an impossibility of pursuing things in the regular way. Trying to get to a point where you can improve, housing in an area by just knocking stuff down and rebuilding it, or, those kinds of generic or kind of ubiquitous developer-led techniques or whatever probably just aren't going to stack up using the traditional tools of viability and those kinds of things. So it becomes necessary, or maybe more kind of credible. We become a more necessary alternative, perhaps. And I think that is potentially very exciting for us, because we have really struggled, particularly in the UK, which I think is probably more conservative than other European countries in terms of its building culture and its attitude to risk in the built environment, to make the project that we really believe in as a process work in a public context and within like the kind of regular frameworks that public projects happen in. And I think this is quite a critical opportunity for us actually to really set out what we do, how it's different to the status quo, and how lots of those things which have kind of accreted over time within regulatory and bureaucratic systems like planning and the kind of the level of financial risk that's tolerated in the public sector on building projects, and all these things are just so built towards conservatism. And I think if one of the outcomes is that those can't be returned to as a set of defaults for the next 5 or 10 years, and that we can articulate the value of a different practice, which has been around for a while. We didn't, people have been talking even in the GLA and places like people like Nabil Hamdi since like the 60s about alternative forms of more activist planning and practice. But they've always been like one side department or one desk in the kind of public office.
It's interesting to go back to the reference in both in the introduction. You also refer to it to designing for uncertainty or indeterminate spaces. So if we would bring it on the level of spaces itself and the design of the spaces, and then I don't speak about the practice itself. How do you think about that in reference to the book that you proposed to us to read and to and what you are doing now also for Atelier Luma, this place where the title was in fact of the presentation for Atelier Luma, designing for uncertain times.
I mean, that piece is it's the Florian Bagel and Philip Christo piece, Designing for Uncertainty, and they always had such a nice way of talking about how you can design something. I think architects always go through this process of having program first, and somehow they manage to think about like architectural ideas as something separate and to program. And when you think about it, it makes so much sense, because you'll find in London that like a house might be designed in the 18th century for a kind of bourgeois family, which then becomes 5 different houses for like a much lower working class family, which then becomes like an architecture school, which then goes back to becoming like a house, which then goes to become a hospital, which then moves to something. And so what it talks about is the idea of a Georgian house, which has some rooms with large ceilings, some rooms with large proportions, some rooms which are smaller with lower ceilings, with different type of light qualities, is actually something which is very, can be used for many different things. And so in a way, when you're thinking about designing architecture or something, the idea of designing something specifically for a program doesn't make any sense, because you know that we know that program. So what you need to design is something which has a variety of qualities, and through its construction doesn't inhibit something to be changed. And so it's I think it's something that we always look back to and think about. And for this project, where we're designing a space for the atelier to move into, we're not quite sure what the atelier is going to be in 5, 10, 50, 100 years. But we can work in a way that we design certain types of infrastructure, which we know you should be able to adapt in certain ways quite easily in the future. And then we can test out scenarios. So it comes back to another piece, which I think is in there, which is from Stuart Brand, which is talking about, this strategic way of designing buildings so that they don't basically become defunct because they're only suitable for one purpose. So how can you design something which, like a Georgian house, can be used for many different things? And so he thinks that you should look at different scenarios in the future of what something could be used for, and then in a way test the architectural idea against those scenarios. So would it work as a hospital? Would it work as a house? Would it work? And they're kind of extreme examples, but
I think designing for uncertainty might also be not only to do with spaces, but also with processes. Like when you want to go towards a different way of doing architecture or a different way of using space and so on, it might also need different kinds of solutions. So how do you discover those different kinds of solutions, maybe on the material level, maybe on working together and so on? Like, for example, when you're prototyping local materials and you want to integrate it into a project, how do you make it be accepted by insurances, by public bodies and so on? So also there is like designing for uncertainty. It's like how to allow for new processes to happen in our building culture. It's also a kind of design that needs to happen. It's not only like the spaces in the future, how will they will they be used? It's also like, how can we work together to allow for new things to happen while we're building? Like it's the culture of the building process. How can that change? How can that be designed? For me, there's also a kind of design for uncertainty, how to manage risk when you try out new things. How to have all the noses of every building partner, which is a lot in construction processes. How to have every nose of every building partner in the same direction. It's a kind of a human relations design or something also. So for me, that's also design for uncertainty. Besides the space design of future space uses.
If I may add something here, I mean, we've been working on the Parc des Ateliers that you all have visited, for more than 10 years now, and the intent was to create space, for flexibility, basically just not having a space that has a specific, that is specifically designed for a specific use. But more allowing for volumes and spaces to be used, in different formats. And it's something that we have been experiencing. But interestingly enough, you see that it impacts the construction process and the building process, the contractors, because the contractor wants to know what he's going to build and what's the purpose of things. And then you have all the legal aspects of all that building process as well. And it's really something that we have been confronted with for the past 10 years almost, and you see that there is a limit. There is a legal limit because you are within a legal framework that doesn't allow for this to happen actually. And then you have the contractor who is to know what's going to happen so that he can build the proper business model out of it. And that's it's really something that raises so many issues.
And there it shows, I think, that it's really like a culture of building. Like it's not only about the building in itself; it's also about the whole soft aspects around it, and like legal, but also human, economic, and so on. Yeah, and that refers a bit to the text that Rotor has written back in the days for the Oslo Architecture Triennale, which talks about pockets of sustainability. And it exactly talks about this, like they showed in this Oslo Triennale, they showed sustainable projects, like the concept of sustainability. But before all, they wanted to show what are the presumptions that make sustainability possible inside a bubble, because you're creating sustainability within a system which might not be sustainable. So you're always working with limits of your sustainable project or your sustainable concept, and you're always assuming a certain sustainability within like axioms, within assumptions of a project. And so indeed, I think I think this culture of building with the limits that we find when we try to go for a certain kind of sustainability, certain kind of architectural quality or resilience for the future and so on, we indeed hit certain limits of our building culture. And so I think periods of crisis are good moments to change systematically a culture. I think we have seen it in the post-World War II in our society. The changes were really enormous for our societies. And I think maybe also here there's this possibility of systemic change, maybe not total, but at least parts of it. That we can take the next steps as a society.
And I think what is interesting is also because in these periods, people are willing to take more risks, of course. They're willing to take bigger leaps than previously they would have done.
Hopefully.
Let's hope. So I think that comes also back to these big changes that hopefully happen after crisis, is because of that. Suddenly those risks are allowed and people dare to do maybe more because they see that the goals.
Do you see examples of that? Because I'm trying to identify them, because you're talking very vague about it. Can you give me a concrete example?
A really specific example for the future is I heard Joe talking about, back in the days, it was naivety, how we tackled uncertainty, but it gets more and more difficult to tackle uncertainty once you know more about what it holds and this uncertainty, what it means for your business model and so on, and what effect it can have. And I think now, for example, I think there will be a lot of maybe not on the big organizational level, but maybe on the individual level, there will be a lot of tendency to take more risk. For example, if people have a kind of basic income, which at this moment governments are kind of already giving for people who have lost their income during the corona crisis. So if you have something basic to fall onto, like my basic needs are covered, I can buy food, I can have education for my children and so on, maybe people will be willing to take more risks towards what they think, what they really believe in, instead of putting those risks aside because there's no putting those opportunities aside because there's no something to fall back on, and we just have to survive. So I'm just going to go with this model because I have no other option. So it's, for me, that's something really specific that can, on the individual mass level, can really change how we perceive risk and uncertainty if we have a basis to fall back onto.
I also want to address something else. In both your practices, the role of the local and think local and so on, that of course is a hollow phrase because nobody is really local anymore, if we are really critical to it. How will that change now in your practices? If I only already think about how that you collaboratively design and work together, how that you develop a building or a project together with other people, and how that then is constructed on a certain place, in a certain, all these things in these kind of times of confinement are under pressure and redefined, in fact. How will that also affect your practices that for me were and are still one of the kind of practices, architectural practices that are the most, from these years, kind of promising a new model of architecture and in itself, but also your models are now under pressure by this, or am I not seeing everything?
Well, I think, I guess we're quite different in terms of, BC, in terms of our working practice is, I think, actually quite distinct. So I'm less clear how it might affect, the way that you're building in lots of different contexts in a very applied way. But for us, I think, something I don't talk a massive amount about, but I think really aware of the extent to which our best work has always been done when there's a really deep investment in a particular context, and a lot of understanding that rises out of that, which isn't always, a lot of which is relational or very, personal, not the kind of thing that you can sum up in a report at the end of a stage, or, there's a lot of trust that's accumulated through a personal relationship rather than just a professional expertise or advice. But I guess since the Liverpool project and the Turner Prize, we've also been working in many, many more contexts. And that's, I guess, like the much more common, increasingly, architecture practices working all over the world. And actually, when I think about like really good bodies of work, there's people like Gion A, Swiss architect who's worked not exclusively, but very intensively in like one place. And people like Luigi Snozzi as well, and like even like going back to like Palladio in Vicenza, people who really over time had an immense impact on a place through lots and lots of small gestures. And I think it's really interesting, like in projects where we work like that, architects don't have a great like public rapport. Generally, they're seen as the kind of, in all these like British sketch shows, whenever there's an architect, it's just the sort of, the stooge who wants to build a tower for some people for the wealthy developer, or there's not a huge amount of public trust. And like even when there was a huge government school building program, like the Minister for Education was coming out and saying that architects' role in this was creaming off the milk, right, at the top of the, within these public funding projects. Like, and that's something that people aren't like, that's not true, because most people don't engage with architects in a real world sense, right? Like, unless you've got a lot of money to commission them. Even in public projects, we're quite removed and shielded by consultation. So I think possibly it might become more difficult to build abroad. And we might have to go back to thinking more about what we can do in places that we really understand, right? Like, I think what's interesting about those projects that we did 5 or even 10 years ago was that they were extremely potent. They did an awful lot with a very limited amount of resource, in a way which we struggle to do now when we're facing conventional building projects, because building is just so much more, increasingly expensive as labour is more expensive and there's more risks involved. It's crazy how expensive it is getting and how difficult it is getting to build. And I think if one of the outcomes is that we have to refocus on a much more local form of practice, which requires a much deeper understanding in order to get good results and to do things that are of value, and then, value in a kind of broader sense, including kind of cultural and economic and social and ecological value, then that would be a good thing. And I think we're better placed to do great projects in that mold anyway, than we are entering into a field of international competition against other people that specialize in building, because I don't think we are as specialized in the design and construction of buildings as other architects who only provide that service. We are interested in an attempt to work in a much more holistic way, but that has been difficult to do because public projects don't look for people with holistic services. They look for experts rather than comprehensive kinds of skill sets. It's very difficult to be the outlier in those conversations when that requires a huge amount of tolerance of risk and uncertainty and openness from a client's perspective. So it's not.
You both also were nurtured, and then BC and assemble in one way or another of the world of biennials, the world of culture itself. That will also dramatically change. These were like platforms that you could use to show this alternative practice that you developed in itself. That will fundamentally change. And if you gave and give a lecture again, most of the time people agree, but we are preaching also a little bit in our own bubble, and we stay a lot in our own bubbles. How can we break the comfort zones, and how can we get out of it? And that is the trick, or the where we can make we have to make the shifts, I think.
I think different times, different heroes. I think that's of Thomas Lomme. It's an interesting quote, I think. And now there are coming different times, and I think we, as well as practices, I think what was interesting, or what we think is interesting, that we continuously look back at what we've done, and we think we're always searching for new ways of also getting out of our box, because I think we also, like you say, we created our bubble and we talk with people who think in the same way. So the dialogue is a very positive one, but I think we have to sensibilize and go outside of our bubble. And I think we've maybe have to look back also at things we've done and see them also in these different times in different ways. So I think what James was saying of our hybrid offices having used this platform of the biennials, it's not anymore of nowadays. We realize we've been maybe doing internationally in different countries many different things, which will be looked back and maybe in a different way in the coming years to come. And I think what we notice also with the development of BC materials, and the developing of materials is something that means and meant a very in-depth understanding of a very specific part of a material in a very specific context, the one of Brussels. BC materials is linked to Brussels in so many ways. And I think it is interesting for our office being hybrid, but to still manage now to go very in-depth in certain aspects of it. So if you want really systematic change, you need that. You can speak a language, but you'll have to learn to teach the language. You'll have to learn the grammar of it. We have done many things, I think, intuitively, naively, as we said. But now we have to understand why we were naive and what were the elements which were interesting of it, in order to kind of learn from those mistakes, learn from the kind of grammar of our offices, in order to advance also in these different times, which, because they will ask also for us quite some flexibility. I think we've been having lectures all around the world. I think we'll have to think twice when we take a plane and go somewhere for a day. Also, I think teaching will become a very important part of our practices. I mean, the educational aspect was always very important. We have an office, we have space. Why shouldn't we, instead of going to school, let students come here and learn from our environment as well, to open up our bubble? Because those students there have been taught in complete different times again, and we can learn from them as much as they can learn from our mistakes or our uncertainties. And I think we need more failures to fail much more. I think once you fail, you learn things, you go on. And I think in times like these, I think failures are more accepted because we're gonna take more risks. So
learn to fail.
Yeah.
I want to come back on this because this naive approach intrigues me, and also the language issue. It was also addressed yesterday by Alexandre Cadet, where we had a conversation with, and he was saying, he is in an academic world where the hyper specialists are not able to talk anymore to each other, and he really believed that, and it was quite convincing, I think, that artificial intelligence is able to create a kind of general intellect and to connect us again and to make a kind of homo universalis. Found that a very inspiring idea. What are tools to, you think, in architecture and to connect different expertises and the non-expert and the expert in different ways together? Because that will be also one of the challenge. This moment, in this state of exception, we are ruled by so-called experts. So how can we find other ways of creating environments with bringing people together?
I mean, I always think of the project of Assemble as really like, if you look through a lot of our old projects, it's all about collaboration. And I think really our skill set, as James says, maybe we're not expert designers, but our skill set is in like knowing or finding the right people at the right time or something. And it's like knowing that. And if you look through a lot of the projects that we've done, it's always like this was a collaboration with this person who's like particularly talented at making tiles or something, because it was a certain project that required something to be made, and we thought this would be a good thing, and that's the person that will deliver it. And then in another project, someone else and someone else and someone else. And I think that comes from, I don't know, I mean, Assemble itself is just a group of you could say like different experts or people who have got, I wouldn't call us experts, but have got different backgrounds. So from people who, studied English or philosophy to people that are much more focused in architecture to people actually much more focused on like the arts. And I think, I don't know, somehow by having all these different voices in the room, for us, it's very easy to then add another one. So we find it very easy to collaborate with people because it's like, oh, it's just another person added in. And I think that, yeah, I don't know. It feels to me that like if you can be the kind of the person, I don't know. It reminds me of this Spinal Tap quote where he's talking in the band in Spinal Tap as like, you know, the lead guitarist is like fire and the singer's like ice. And I think the bass player describes himself as lukewarm water. And he's kind of like the person that can hold the band together by not being expert at either of them. And it's quite nice, quite a funny, nice phrase. But if you can like make projects happen like that, I think that's something that we always try and do.
It also reminds me of Case Design, like the office from India that we worked together a bit this summer, which had the exhibition which was called The Craft of Collaboration. So, you know, maybe it becomes more and more, it's not yet about the buildings or how the architecture appears, you know, like it's not like a David Chipperfield project, you know, like for me, what is interesting about architecture, about building culture is the deep collaborations that you can make, because these are very complex projects. It's like one of the most complex things that human beings can do is like build together. So the options which are there to have like to create new models, new processes, that is what really interests me a lot. And I think that's also a bit what I hear when Joe is talking. It's almost more about the model of collaboration, which ingredients you bring together in which manner. That is maybe an opportunity for letting architecture evolve or something. It's not only anymore about how the space exactly looks, or it's more about setting up a model that can last after, you know, or that can have an impact as a model, not as a building, after the project is done, for example.
I think this idea or this ability to be able to collaborate allows you to make much more logical projects or something, or work in a much more like a way that makes sense, common sense, because you're not pushing like a particular agenda through a hole that it doesn't fit. It's always like, in this situation, it makes most sense for like this person to do this and this person to do this. And we're going to use this local craft person and this particular material from down the road, and it'll look like this. And it won't have, you know, the same aesthetic as all the other projects, but it's like, this makes the most sense because it's this mix of people here. And in another situation, it'll be another mix of people. And maybe the product is a building, but actually maybe the product is not a building. Maybe it's that, you know, we need to run an event, or maybe actually the situation here. So it's like you're much more open to providing the thing which answers the real question, because you're so much happy to collaborate with different situations and different people.
And I think to add on that means like projects become way more intensive. And therefore, I think, I mean, imagine you have this practice, and how would you manage to do 10 of these projects in a year? Impossible, I think, because the intensity you put in such a project is way more higher than just being the architect behind the computer and to delegate. And so therefore, I think also in the future, I mean, practices just learn to build less but better, and take much more kind of joy from one project, and understand that there's so many levels within a building that he can touch and he can work with and collaborate with. So, I mean, the amount of things we're producing and consuming is I mean, it's just degenerating. And I think the practices we have, due also to their holistic approach, they are in a way also producing maybe less, or not thinking of the end product, but thinking much more of the process of reaching that end product. And because thinking of that process more, and you put so much more energy in a building. I think building less will be, and thinking of footprints and all these things, and maybe before building, understanding, do you actually need to build it? I mean, sometimes people want to build, but actually it's just reorganization. And so I think these things will become also hopefully more part of an architect's practice or task.
Such a nice story about those architects like Tom Vassal who were asked to redesign a school because they found that there was always a crush in the corridors when all the kids finished their lessons, and so they were tasked to redesign the school. And so lots of architects would take that as an amazing opportunity to design a kind of whole brand new section. But actually they just decided that the thing they should do is just stagger the alarms within the school so that one class finished 5 minutes earlier than the next. And then they didn't need to build anything. And somehow that's like a really, that's what architects should be doing more, is thinking in a much, looking at the whole situation and saying, is the answer to this actually a building, or is the answer to this a change in structure somewhere else?
But there is another thing that I wanted, that was also mentioned in the beginning, that was Lawrence, that say the architect as activist. Both practices also are dealing with appropriating tools and giving tools back to people, empower people not only by knowledge but also really like enable back and to what Ken was saying, maybe connecting again by building chains in itself. So it's a very Marxist idea, of course, this power on production and means of production itself. That's also core in the practice. That is fully different than the traditional deterministic, mechanistic architecture practice of today.
So if I'm understanding, or how I might interpret it, is like, for me, production, just to do production, is maybe not interesting. It's maybe more like, what kind of social impact can that production have? What are the processes that impact people? Like, so yeah, we're working a lot at BC with local materials, natural materials, low-tech kind of construction principles to try and open up the construction process, the process of production of a building towards a wide range of people. And yeah, I think that's because production in itself, the act of making, has really a lot of power in it. But if we like, if we are forced to bring it into a certain production model which alienates, which links chains all over the world and brings materials from China to Europe, which are then processed into components and then into buildings. I think, not saying that this is totally bad. Sometimes it's maybe logic to do that, but I think we should. What is more interesting is to use production as a kind of lever to also create social impact, to question models of how we make things, how we work together, and so on. So for me, that's I think where the more interesting side of human production lays. It's more like, I believe, more in a local, decentralized kind of production, where the modes of production are not hidden away from the communities that use the outcome of it.
I think to add on it maybe is the performance we're actually doing. We were discussing that with you, Ken, a couple of weeks ago. The fact that what we're doing is almost indeed is a performance that by some might be seen as activistic, or as seen from an activist point of view. But for us, this performance is needed in order to influence people outside of our bubble. And it's not as if we propose a building process which is better than another. It's just it's a performance that shows that what we have learned, or what students maybe have learned at schools as being the process of doing architecture, is maybe just not right, or there's so many different ways of seeing it. Who says that what their teachers or architects or references have done was the way of doing it? And we're just performing in a certain way with BC materials, something that suddenly makes other things collapse and the reality of things suddenly change. Because I also don't think that we have a system installed which works.
Maybe just to explain quickly this idea about performance, because it's quite interesting. Like BC Materials is a part of BC which produces materials like plasters, blocks, and a kind of clay concrete. And so we're bringing it on the market, and people are like, contractors can buy it, clients can buy it. It's being inserted in projects and so on. So we're really entering into competition with the building materials market as it exists now, but we do it from a position of trying to have as much as impact as possible with our production. So we communicate a lot about it. We're open source. We BC Materials is shown in exhibitions, through movies. We talk about it and so on. So at the same time, while we're competing in the building materials market, at the same time where we're really doing production with machinery, with resources and norms and certifications and so on, like the whole thing about bringing a building material on the market, at the same time we're like creating a kind of cultural performance of an economic model. Like we're not interested in becoming a material producer. We're interested in the cultural impact, the building culture impact that a material production company can have in our sector or in our society. And so that's a bit the idea of going as far as possible with this performance, because we have a real company. We're talking with impact investors. We need to buy machinery to upscale, to drive a bit down our prices so that we're more concurrential for the building market. So it's with all the logic of a building material company. We need to think about IP, intellectual property, and so on. Like it's a real business, but it's a cultural performance. And this balance between it is something that we're researching now, and that is bringing us a lot of topics to reflect on. But that's why it's interesting, like to see how far we can go with this production model while not losing the cultural impact of it.
I have a question, if I may ask you all, and it's kind of like from the number of topics that you mentioned. There's a couple of things that struck me, and this broadly is, in a way, uncertainty in a period of like extensive and newly created phobias as well. So like one of I'm trying to kind of like structure this question. But like you spoke about terrorism, we spoke about the viruses, we spoke about all these kind of like new relationships that are being created in social spaces, in private spaces. And there's a lot of uncertainty, also a lot of anxiety and phobia too. Like all of this is forms of fears also. And at the same time, there's like bigger shifts which are taking place. They also like they're announcing bigger shifts. Do you see the way that you kind of like practicing, or are you concerned with the possibility of, or do you position yourself like as how do you position yourself in this kind of shifts? And if you are concerned with like being somewhere where it's the end of a previous situation, but the what comes next might be also a big shift for you.
the main anxiety I feel about it is, that it'll definitely mean some kind of change to like the viability or the kind of, the business model in some respects. But I'm not that wedded to the idea. I feel very clearly about the kind of, if things remained exactly as they have been for the past 10 years, then I think the progression would have been increasingly towards us being a practice concerned mostly with the design and construction of buildings in response to other people's briefs. And I think that is directly a result of it being very difficult to articulate the value in another approach, which seems very alien within the ways that lots of people are looking to commission projects. And it's perceived to be riskier, less clear, all of these things. So in a way, I think there was actually already quite a high level of pressure being exerted on the kinds of practice that we're not exclusively, but most interested in doing, and it reflects the wider set of interests in the group that we work together as. So in that respect, like that mode of practice being less possible or less viable will, I think, necessitate us revisiting some of the other more general things, and we probably need to just be better at articulating why the skills that we have make us capable of responding to whatever the future holds, right? But we're not the kind of organization that has some big strategic plan anyway, or really sees, I think we're quite a versatile tool as a group of people, which enables us to sort of, not just make buildings or other products or things, but also, do organizing work and do more kind of strategic, we work on a very, at one end of the practice, quite an extraordinary variety of things. Some of which are kind of more or less part of the group, and some are contained more with individuals. But yeah, I think it's actually it'll be a really interesting time for our practice. It doesn't mean it's going to be like the time where we all feel like we've got the most stability from the organization necessarily. But I think it might be a time where we start to work through how we do work, which is less conventional, and with more people that are inclined to work in a more conventional way, because that might become a bit more necessary for them. They might be a bit more open to it. So I think in that sense, we can't just hold on to what we had before and try to make that work. That's obviously, things have changed, so we have to roll with that. But we're pretty well adjusted to doing that because we're not that highly specialized in the skills that we have or the work that we do. We have quite a comprehensive ability as a group of people, right? So I think it's actually a very exciting time for us as much as a fearful or anxious one.
I think what you say about the fact of us not being specialized, or the fact of not being specialized, helps in these kind of conditions. It's not as if suddenly a certain branch has been kind of cut down and you lost the whole part. It's not, I think both practices are not really based on such a kind of system. I have the feeling the same ensemble or BC has grown out of in a very organic, not at all planned way, and it means that these kind of situations where we, such as the one we are now in, just feeds the practices, feeds them in order to kind of grow maybe in a different way again and reflect on what has been. So indeed, I think it's more a kind of opportunity than a kind of setback or something.
I have one other question. Something we never discussed before is, and it's also something I question for Atelier, is and which is super important, is how the technology is evolving. I mentioned already artificial intelligence, and how do you see in your practices, not technical knowledge and engineering as such, but technology as we know it, becoming part of your practices of building and constructing? I know, of course, that in these different time scales that you are talking about and analyzing buildings, like Stuart Brent is doing that. Technology is a fast evolving mechanism. But how do you use it in order to infuse or want to use it maybe in the future in your practices? That is something I'm questioning, how these practices that you have both could use also technology in an interesting way.
I'm becoming more and more interested in technology and using it within our practice, both in terms of the way in which we go about designing stuff and then also the way in which we build. Because I think there's like a huge nostalgia which exists within architecture, in more so than any industry, like that I know of. Like if you look at like engineering and things, where it's like in architecture school, it's like people are really still obsessed with the way that you draw plans and sections, and the lack of engagement with stuff like BIM, and I don't know. There's like a whole nostalgia. Even if you look at the images that architects make, they use like images from paintings of the past and stuff. It's like it's all there, and somehow I worry that a lot of the time, the way in which we talk about our practice and the way in which we work really is looking back, like always looking back. And it's like, references of like building the way they used to build, 400, 500, 2,000 years ago. And there's nothing which looks forward, which really was, like in the 80s or something with the high tech era, it was much more that way. And then suddenly, I don't know, since all of my education, it's always been backwards, references of this and things. And so there's really interesting stuff, that's happening with efficiency, I think, and technology. There's a building James was talking about the other day where it's like scanning bits of timber, which couldn't be used because it's got unnatural growth or it's felled in a particularly strange way, and scanning it to see its structure so that you can use it, so that really like which points can take load and which points can't. And yeah, I think there's interesting stuff about using machines for labor and building more accurately and using less material and making stuff more efficient. And it's something that we need to engage with all the other ideas that we're talking about. We also need to engage with this, the way in which we present.
I mean, it's like now the tools exist, and I feel like to some extent they're accelerating so quickly, and it's a genuine challenge, I think, for small organizations to maintain pace with the rate of change, right? So yeah, like we obviously don't have the same like technological tools at our disposal in design that some larger offices have, and that is genuinely an issue, because I think once you have, it's a bit like being content with using Bronze Age tools when the Iron Age is kicking off, and just because you haven't got the organizing capability to develop that technology yourself. Like the future isn't bronze just because you like it and it's good for what you're doing at the moment. But at the same time, I think there's often an overemphasis maybe coming out of stuff like high tech of, the tool being also containing its own design logic, which isn't necessarily true. So that building Joe talks about where they scan all the different trees to use component parts where they were all forked timbers, which are traditionally never used because the point where two branches join is a huge knot and it's a real weak point. Incredibly materially efficient, but totally impractical structure, right? It's like a demonstration of the technology. And in a way, sometimes just some some pragmatism. I'm interested in things which are replicable, which other people can learn from and apply. That's very different to, the field of architecture, which is primarily concerned with like the one-off or the novel, and the thing which is really cutting edge, right? And so I think we have a slightly different aim. Yeah, I think in a way, if we talk a lot about fear in this conversation in some ways, or anxiety, that people like us are very anxious about technology because we don't really understand it. But that does need to change, because otherwise we aren't going to be able to do things which other much more prosperous industries like construction, who are capable of investing in the technologies which will enable them to build at scale much more cheaply. If we can't be part of that conversation and literate in it at least, then we're sort of just talking about aesthetics, and we're talking about quite marginal concerns. And I don't think that's our interest, as distinct from maybe some other architectural practices who are primarily interested in making and see the value in, the one-off buildings as kind of demonstrations of craft. But I think we're interested more in craft but applied technologies and their ability to bring about like material improvements in people's situations, right? And we can't do that by just relying on old technologies, because they're increasingly that they rely on huge amounts of labor, and labor is the only thing that's getting more and more expensive, right? So it's a big challenge for us though, because it's expensive. Like the licenses are expensive, the training is expensive. It's like,
if you go back to like 2010 and following the financial crisis, and over the last decade, I'll kind of be very crude here, but what has sort of happened in architecture is there's been a sort of decline of the starchitect, and there's been a kind of rising of other more kind of interesting practices kind of coming through and being a bit more nimble and versatile with what they see architecture as and how people make buildings. But if we sort of fast forward to 2030 and make some sort of big assumptions, where do you think the architectural world could kind of go in the next sort of 10 years based on the kind of impacts that this crisis may have? I know we're just a few months into it, so it's hard to draw any conclusions. But what do you think could be the most positive things to come out of this going through the next decade?
I would say decentralized, localized, connected multitudes of practices, something like that. Like not big practices like the model of the star architects, but like connected, exchanging practices, like networked practices who don't see each other as competition, but see more in the model of exchange, and who can operate more locally, sometimes a bit further, but when you do it further, it's connected, and like always connected to a context. And to have like this decentralized model of production of knowledge, also production of materials, like not the super centralized international chains of materials or groups of architects that come and do the project and then leave again. It's more like decentralized, contextualized, connected practices.
Good. Thank you, I would say.